Well, in this upcoming lectures, we're going to deal with few issues of displacement, dispossession vis-a-vis development, and today we're going to look at some of the issues pertaining to conservation-induced displacement, and also try to deal with few of the cases which have been studied by other scholars. Now, as we all know how the idea of conservation or nature conservation emerges, and the very notion of the idea of how wilderness thinking emerges in the West. Now, if we are to historically locate two important development that is on the very notion of the idea of how this nature conservation has emerged. So we can sort of like look into important historical moments which are categorized and partly given by Jim Ikwe. So the first one that is predates to the period of 18th to 19th century in England, where the enclosure movement began. So which also tries to look into the way in which how the common property has been transformed into the private property, and secondly the expansion of the the model of national parks, and we are already familiar with the works of John Muir, who was also pretty much known for his idea of wilderness thinking, and he was in fact the mastermind who actually took the idea of how these national parks has been established. So this, in some way, this development has captured the imaginations of the elites, not just confined to Europe and the US, but also globally, and many of what we have today, popularly known as protected areas or national parks, has in some way rooted its history from this historical development. So again, the very idea of how this wilderness, that is nature and national parks, has begun to bring about the social construct of the very notion of wilderness, and also the way in which how this assumption, that is by bringing in the very idea of private property, could in some way tries to protect the nature or natural resources, which in some way was already posited by Garrett Hardin in his paper, which is entitled as The Tragedy of the Commons, that if the common resources are open to all, so in due course of time there are chances that it might lead to a depletion of resources, and eventually the sustainable use of resources will be affected. And in due course of time, like the resources will be vulnerable to depletion, and therefore a strict rules and which in some way push towards the emergence of this notion of private property or access or to restriction in some way has begun to shape up in this period. Now, why are national parks again important? In some sense, it is sort of trying to put aside the wild animals, or maybe so to say, in the name of conserving them or preserving them, and then by proclaiming some animals as being endangered species. So there is this establishments of fencing of forests by the state or maybe by any organization, more importantly in order to protect the lands. And this is in contradiction to keeping the land or maybe the forest open to all, and in the process it has an overarching impact on the communities who have been depending on these resources for ages. And by their traditional or maybe through their community conservations, these communities have in some sense been sustainably using. However, these very notions of restrictions of access or restriction to use these resources have gone in contradiction to the very idea of this dispeopled. So therefore, the very ideas of these privatizations of land are in some way standing in contradiction to the collective rights or the communal ownership or community-based resource management. So this process in some way resonates with the concept of what is coined by Karl Marx as the primitive accumulation, which of course is a process by which it divorces the workers from the ownership of the conditions of his own labor. So there is this sense of being alienated from the access to resources which they have been using for ages, maybe millennia or maybe the past successive generations. So therefore, the very notions of this privatization of land, which of course we have already covered extensively when we were discussing about idea of the common property versus the private property in the earlier lectures. Now, if we elaborate further these notions of primitive accumulation, which of course is being popularized by none other than Marx. So according to Michael Perelman, these modes of production in some way can occur in three important ways. That is, as a direct expropriations of people's means of livelihood, and again by using or through coercion, that forcing people to enter wage labor, and also by the manipulations of the division of labor. So these characteristics can be seen in the different aspects of the contemporary conservation policies and practices. By the catalyst is what we understood as the expropriation. So the kind of direct expropriations of forest lands and also in some way forcing people to adopt wage labor is seen as necessary to create protected areas as undisturbed wild spaces for more importantly fauna, flora and tourists, and which Dent Brockington calls as the fortress conservation. So in a way there is this notion of while appreciating the art aesthetics of this wilderness, there is a creations of this undisturbed or keeping the nature in isolations or in its pristine form. So coming to what is meant by displacement, because we have different forms of displacement, displacements as a consequence of war, and then maybe natural calamities, and then so on and so forth. But if you put displacement in a nutshell, it aims to cover a range of phenomena in the literature on the displaced peoples, including loss of access of or restrictions on livelihood opportunities, or maybe the future income related to the environmental resources, which is sort of outlined and defined by Sarnia. And on the other hand, the dictionary meanings of yet again displacement is nothing but removal of a thing from its place or putting out of place. So which sort of like corresponds to the idea of how there is a process of physical removal of people from a particular place. So as I had pointed out that there can be different causes of displacement, but what we are trying to look into this particular course is that displacement or dispossession does take place on account of conservation or maybe development or maybe by certain others kind of environmental related issues, and in which of course and wilderness conservations or so and so forth, with which of course we will be dealing through it. And one can also talk about the way in which how encroachment takes place through the land acquisition process by the states, and then of course also by the the corporates or the multinational companies with respect to for example the mining in eastern India. So we'll be discussing all those in detail in the upcoming lectures. So how do we then make sense of development and displacement, and how does displacement takes place as a consequence of development? So unlike some of the impacts or the effects of natural disasters or more importantly like wars, because even at a time of wars we do see or witness people being displaced, and then they have become refugees, and then they wander around maybe in and around the proximity or maybe across other national borders, right? So therefore displacement again which are undertaken on account of or as a consequence of this development purposes is the magnitude is much more higher in compared to all this, and this is perhaps one of the justifications which are given by people who push this kind of policies and programs by outlining that of course displacement thus occurs not necessarily by the development pursuits or developmental policies. So therefore the kind of permanency of displacement is also equally true with regards to the conservation related problems like the establishments of national parks and so on and so forth. So displacement because of development interventions typically related to the infrastructural projects such as the building of dams, construction of roads, and also state-owned plantations, the extraction of mineral resources which are in general parlance known as mining, and laying down of pipelines and urban reconstruction, of course is this development interventions of course has led to the displacements of people between 100 and 200 million since 1980. So the past few decades have actually seen the enormous displacement issues which have being sprang up. So Sarnia in his studies estimated that the total number of people displaced as a result of development related projects between 1980 and 2000 to be close to 200 million people. So you could actually imagine the magnitude or the scale of how these displacement or people, the displacees are have really encounter such kind of issues, and the problems are related not just limited to livelihood issues, but also pretty much related with the violations of their human rights, and then because oftentimes these development interventions are again being sponsored with the use of coercion and violence. So people are forcibly evicted and not necessarily voluntary. So you could actually see that people are actually being evicted from their natural habitats, and then which of course has a multiplicity of impacts and consequences. So it can be economic, it can be social, it can be cultural, and so on and so forth. But many of these developmental agencies in some way happen to I mean, all these issues often remained unnoticed, and also the problems of rehabilitations and resettlement policies are often being ignored, or if at all at a very minimal level. So that actually cause a lot of problems to millions of people across the world. So this policy response to the development induced displacement and resettlement is pretty much depicted well in what Sarnia terms as impoverishment risk and reconstruction model, or popularly known as the IRR model. So Sarnia in his studies identifies 8 sources of risk, primarily economic in nature, and that perhaps contribute to the impoverishment of the people who are being displaced from their habitat or from their home. So these are issues of landlessness, joblessness, homelessness, marginalization, food insecurity, morbidity and mortality, and also loss of access to common property and services, and also social disarticulations. So when a community or a particular group of people are being resettled somewhere, or they are being evicted, economic dependence or their means of livelihood is one thing. On the other hand, it also causes a lot of anxiety, because of they are being socially cut off from people around them, because in places like the rural areas, people are pretty much that sense of security is also about how they are mutually dependent among themselves, that at times of like disasters, they have usually get a helping hand from their neighbors, near and dear ones, relatives, so on and so forth. So that sense of social security is also being destabilized as a result of displacement or development induced displacement. Now, how do we then relate and associate between the conservations and displacement? Now, displacement again is also a consequence of conservation, and we all know like what conservation projects are, and what does it sort of like lead to, and then what are the objectives or the motives of bringing about these conservation projects. Because conservation as we have discussed, like development is inherently spatial. So conservation of species and ecosystem requires the restrictions on human populace, their influences the local, state, and again corporate in areas where species or ecosystems are supposedly to be conserved. So one could actually see that in the past 5 decades and more importantly until the 1990s, that there is a faster growth rate of the protected areas, and which of course has posed a lot of problems to many of those communities who are supposedly the forest dwellers, and then the marginalized communities, the Adivasis, the tribal communities, and so on and so forth. So one very pertinent way of evicting or trying to encroach on this habitat or their land is also because of the brute use of force, which is typically critical to displacements from the protected areas, and that displacement has actually caused which we have already outlined, the impoverishment, social disarticulations, and also political disempowerment. So conservation displacement, like other forms of displacement, is compromise of 2 important processes. That is, the first one, that is the forced removal of people from their homes, and secondly economic displacement, that is the exclusion of people from particular areas in their pursuit of livelihood. So people who are dwelling on the premises of, for example, a park for ages, however, as a consequence of these protected areas, there is a restriction, and they are in some way unable to gather their fuel, food, firewoods, or maybe to engage in hunting, fishing, or maybe even to pass through these premises to get access to their farmlands and also to other places. And even when people are being not evicted directly, such form of restrictions in some way has affected their everyday life in terms of their pursuit of not simply livelihood, but also in terms of the free movement which they have exercised for generations. So that way it has impacted a lot in terms of their mobility, in terms of their movement, so on and so forth. So one could really imagine that the kind of problems which are being encountered by these people who are actually dwelling on the edge of these protected areas. So one of the main important or the core arguments for establishing biodiversity conservations are its ethical necessity and its critical importance for a sustainable survival. That the intrusions or the if people are being given a free hand, so there are chances of like depletion of resources, and many of these so-called wild animals will be will become endangered. So therefore there is arising and or urging need for this ethical necessity, that in order to conserve or to conserve this, it is given the critical importance to sort of cut off this nature from human. So in some sense, the very notions of Western scientific culture or belief in terms of creating a binary can actually be have sort of resurfaced by introducing the so-called biodiversity conservation, the establishment of national parks, and various other policies and programs. Again, those who are engaged in trying to an extensive study about this conservation induced displacement have give a critique of these policies by arguing that there is an element of injustice which is involved in the involuntary removal of disadvantaged people from their homes and forest lands. And the critics of conservation also emphasize that the unethical basis of conservation simply by pointing to the incongruities related to displacement. So indeed, the increasing emphasis on poverty alleviation among international donors and aid organizations have often come at the expense of concern for conservation. So coming to the conservation induced displacement, what we really want to discuss today is that with the increasing attempts or with the by pushing forward the very idea of preservation via displacement are in some sense an example of the manifestations of the fortress. We all know that the fort, which is barricaded, and we can't really freely get access to it because there's a lot of restrictions, and there is a very isolated ideas which are being related with that. So this manifestation of the fortress or an exclusionary conservation paradigm in some sense support which has increased lately due to the escalating conservation threat. So one important point here is to understand or take into consideration the dynamic of livelihood, that is livelihood context of the displaced communities, especially the ecological base of their livelihood, and which is again critical to any assessment of their pre and post displacement livelihood strategies and livelihood incomes, which include income, poverty, food security, and health. So therefore displacement in some way also resulted in a rapid proletarianization and pauperization. So proletarianization, which of course have already been elaborated earlier, is to push or forcibly put people into a state of vulnerability, that is by making them or depend on as a daily wage labor. So and they're in a state of pauperism or pauperizations, and their integrations into the national mainstream occur at highly disadvantageous terms. So people who are being socially and economically backward again is being displaced as a consequence of these policies of conservation. So in some way they are being doubly exploited, or in the sense the repercussion is much more higher, because on the one hand they are at a disadvantageous positions, and on the other hand there is forcible evictions or pushed from their own home and land, or maybe or their restrictions or resources. So that way they become pretty much vulnerable, and their sense of livelihood security is pretty much at threat. So one can also talk about that one of the concerns over here is again to engage into looking at the idea of how people are being displaced, and even though the policies and processes flowing from this paradigm are likely to produce, because normally people often talk about that biodiversity conservations or conservations of animals, or maybe the wild animals in some way, are to produce a positive outcome. But people seldom take into account that historically the livelihood outcomes for the displaced people, or those marginalized sections of the peoples are often negative in nature. So the impacts or the outcomes usually are negative rather than being positive. So even in our country and or in India and elsewhere, the examples of the processes of resettlement and rehabilitations of households affected by the conservation-induced displacement are actually very rare, and it also suffers as on account of unfulfilled promises and reduced livelihood security after relocation continue to be the norm, because oftentimes the compensations or rehabilitation takes place at a very slow pace, and then the people are actually being exposed to that risk or vulnerability. So there are unseen processes or elements which are into play when people are being displaced. So the important point which we are discussing here is specific to the issues of economic security or livelihood issue, because the impoverishment risk and the destructions of livelihood generally are pretty much associated with the process of displacement, and also it also tend to vary from place to place, from region to region, and from people to people, because the degree of people who are being marginalized or the degree of marginalization of the displaced community is much more higher compared with people like who are much more in a better state. So therefore it is important for us at this point to also look into how the dynamic livelihood context of the displaced communities, especially people whose livelihood are pretty much dependent on the ecosystem or the natural surroundings, is in some way pretty much critical to any assessment of the livelihood outcomes of displacement. That is, in terms of the impact of the variables like income, poverty, food security, and health, which we have already discussed earlier. Now, one of the major limitations of preservation via dislocation strategy is that it is inherently pretty much regressive in nature, because among people who are being displaced from the protected areas, those who are politically marginalized or politically weak or economically in a very disadvantaged position tend to become more so, and then are also unable to obtain a positive livelihood outcomes. So no matter like how there is an external interventions, maybe an aid or maybe any kind of help from different sources, since they are pretty much that attachment to that their land and the ecology in some way have often put them in a very disadvantageous positions. On the other hand, people who are more empowered and who are in a better economic positions tend to corner all the advantages. So one could see the dichotomy or the differences in terms of people who are being evicted, right? So as we have pointed out that until the period of 1990s, there is a growing numbers of the protected areas, and more importantly in India, which of course is being have actually seen the number of the conservation refugees, that is people who are being voluntarily or involuntarily evicted from their homes and lands as a result of the conservation programs. So one of the main important case for people's locations from the protected areas in India is that it has been built explicitly and implicitly on the hypothesis that human use of their resources causes their degradation over time. That is the kind of blame game which is being posited or finding the fault, that who actually is the culprit. So this notion of thinking in some way postulates that people and wildlife cannot coexist together, as if these are something which is a new phenomenon, or people tends to disregard the kind of conservation knowledge which people have in the past, or in other words, there is the belittling the traditional ecological knowledge of the forest dwellers. There is an urging need to bifurcate or to sort of like put apart between the two in terms of separating the wild and human, or the human and nature, or nature and culture. In some way tries to this sort of hypotheses are being created in order to justify the conservation programs. So therefore, if natural areas are to be safeguarded, people have to be removed. That is, they have to be displaced forcibly or relocated voluntarily from these places. So that's some of the phenomena which have been recurrent as a consequence of these conservation programs. So the very concept of this nature conservation, which we have begin with in the first slide, if you still remember that, why is it that the idea of this nature conservations and the idea of wilderness have emerged. So this very concept of nature conservations is not simply criticized for its practice, but also the very idea which is embedded in it, because there are people who are working pretty much closely, trying to do certain case study and trying to follow many of these conservation programs, have actually questioned the very foundation of this conservation ideology, which is being categorized or branded as an imperialist agenda, or maybe as a civilizing mission, and also as having the mandate to uplift the inferior races of the world. So yet other scholars also highlight that conservation is not as noble as it is thought to be, because a large number of civil society or the NGOs are involved in trying to educate or awareness program that to people that how to save and care for the environment. So in some way people out of nowhere come and then tends to spread this environmental awareness to people who have been closely dwelling and then associated with nature. So in some way, this very notion of civilizing mission of colonialism, or the civilizing mission, or in other words, it is the impositions of the Western civilizational mission. So therefore, from the Western civilizational discourses, people who are living in the wild, or maybe who are close to nature, are seen to be uncivilized, or maybe who are to be brought into the mainstream, or maybe who actually needs to be aware of their responsibilities in terms of how to manage their resources. Now, before discussing the cases of the Van Guzers, who are the pastoral community, and also taking up the case of the Sarisca Tiger Reserve, one can in some way tries to give a critique, or try to look into how this conservation is being forcefully being imposed. That is how the politics of these state resource controls are being pushed forward and then being imposed, because most of the states, or the state's interest, however, appropriate the conservation concerns of many international environmental groups as a means of eliciting support for their own control over productive natural resources. Indeed, some developing states use this conservation ideology to justify coercion in the name of conservation, often by the use of violence, and also the state's mandate to defend the threatened resources and its monopolizations of legitimate violence, combined to sort of facilitate state apparatus building and also social controls. So the legitimate violence in the name of resource control also help states control people, especially the recalcitrant regional groups, marginal groups, or maybe the minority groups who contest state resource claims or otherwise challenge the state's authority. So oftentimes there is a clashes between the state agencies and also the local resource users, because the state have the capacity to control and extract resources, like its capacity to govern is actually a function of the relations between the state and civil society. So therefore, the extraction of valuable resources such as oil and other minerals, or maybe even other resources, in some way have actually witnessed a kind of class of interest. And often there is a power struggle between the state and society, and which are often played out constantly in the in the course of these allocations of resources, or resource control and resource access. So therefore, there is an urging global concerns over conservation, and have how conservation have imposed additional pressures on the states in the hopes of achieving conservation or a sustainable production management objectives. So now, as we are by now familiar with what conservation is, and then what are the correlation between development and displacement, and what actually is conservation-induced displacement. So having said that, we will sort of try to look into some of the issues which perhaps might have affected some of the communities who have closely been using resources and one of them is the Van Gujars, the pastoral community in central India. So the Van Gujars are pretty much dependent on the forest resources, and by profession they are a forest pastoralist, and owing to their nomadic lifestyle since the colonial period, they found themselves at the margin of Indian society. And from the colonialist point of view, they often see that people have to engage in a permanent settlement, not just practicing settled cultivation, but because the imperialist agenda was the idea of how to generate revenue. So until and unless a community is engaged in a settled habitat, or maybe a practice settled cultivations or permanent cultivations, the state can't really come and impose certain kinds of taxes. So therefore the very nomadic nature of this pastoral community in some way have to the eyes of the colonialists, they are be seen to be wild, and then they are seen to be someone who doesn't come within the fold of the state. So therefore their control and ownership of resources are not being recognized by the state as such. So we have this legislation which concern to the management and the protection of the wildlife, which was passed way back in the 1972. So the Wildlife Protection Act in some sense deals with the wildlife protection through the establishment of protected areas, as well as regulations or prohibition of hunting and control of trade in wildlife products. So to a large extent the government's conservation policies in some way restrict the movement of the Van Gujars community. So since they are the pastoral community, like they move on during the winter, they usually move down to the lowland areas because it is cold, and then the grasslands are dried, so therefore they have to go to the lowland areas, whereas in the summer it actually goes to the highland or upland areas to find fodder for their animals. And then it is also a matter of like how well the animals are acclimatized to those areas. So therefore there is a constant movement from the upland to lowland and lowland to upland, which is being witnessed in most of the pastoral communities. So there is often a restriction which is being imposed on their movement, and sometimes there is a denial of their entry to their natural habitat, and so on and so forth. So we have a rights which was being passed in notified in 2008, that is the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers, or the Recognitions of Forest Rights Act, which is popularly known as the Forest Rights Act. In some sense provide a respite to this forest dweller community, because there is a possibility of recognizing their rights, the sense of ownership to stake claim to the forest or the land. Whereas the other traditional forest dwellers, here again means any member or community who has for at least 3 generations residence, that is prior to 2005, and who have primarily resided in and who depends on the forest or forest land for bona fide livelihood needs. So the Act in some sense confers rights over natural resources to the forest communities in order to secure living together with the responsibility to use such resources in a sustainable way. So while trying to look at this particular act, Getgild in some way, writes about that in its preamble. The Act describes that the recognized rights and forest dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers include the responsibilities and authority for sustainable use, conservations of biodiversity, and maintenance of ecological balance, thereby strengthening the conservation regime of the forest while ensuring livelihood and food security of the forest dwelling communities, both the STs and non-STs. So the Act in some way provides a sense of belongingness in forest to the pastoralists and nomads without having them having a permanent address. So the implementations of this Forest Right Act has again been criticized, that the authorities actually put too much stress on the individual rights, and while neglecting the promise of the community right to manage, protect, and conserve forests inherent in the Act. So the struggle over conservation has left many of these Van communities in a state of dilemma, that is, even when still in the forest, but with no defined or decisive rights. So therefore the negotiations over forest rights are likely to result in high stakes. So therefore it remains to be seen that to what extent these new Forest Act are actually going to safeguard the interests of the Van community. Now coming to the Sarisca Tiger Reserve, many of us must be aware about this Tiger Reserve program. The location is in the Alwar district in Rajasthan, and since the colonial period, there has been the, as we have discussed, an urgent need for the protected area strategies on account of the declining resource availability or the urgent need to preserve resource for exclusive colonial use. So most protected areas are actually officially consist of strictly protected inner core owing to the anthropogenic activities. So what is evident from the Sarisca Tiger Reserve is that we have the top-down conservation approach, and the locals are hardly, the interests of the locals are hardly taken into account, and it is also being influenced by this notion of the northern vision, that is the concept of this untouched wilderness. And wilderness, as we all are familiar by now, emphasize on the undisturbed natural area. So the very idea of this wilderness maintain that the presence of the local communities is highly detrimental to the conservation objectives. So therefore conservation policies in fact give rise to considerable conflict between the government, the development institutions, and the local populations. So therefore the dependence of the local communities on the environment and knowledge and traditions of the rural populations are often being sidelined or ignored. And given the current conservation methods, many of the interests of these local populace have been deprived of these opportunities, which are impediment for their survival and development. And the communal lands surrounding these villages is being increasingly privatized, and the conservation of natural resources is closely linked to sustainable development of native populations in developing countries and to the conservation of their way of life. So conservation of natural resources is of course not necessarily important to the aesthetics or ecology, but it also includes the very important dimensions of equality and social justice, which is often being ignored. So what is evident from the Sarisca Tiger Reserve is that one of the emerging opinions from the villagers about the way in which they are being treated, or about the forest department authorities and the conservation policies, is that there is often a complex issues like delocalizations and also trade-off between conservation and social development, which of course is pretty much challenging, and the problems which are usually confronted by the locals. So the second perceptions which is doing the round is that the conservation activities which are undertaken by authorities of the PAs and the socio-economic impact, on the other hand, of the relocations of these human settlement outside the Sarisca Tiger Reserve. So one very peculiar thing about the relationship, the interactions between the villages and forest authorities, is that there is a prevailing sense of antagonism, that is a negative conception of the notions of how the forest dwellers are being perceived. So the tribals are usually named as Biladas by the Bajarias, that is the city dwellers, and the Surwan, those that belong to the better of Kazan communities, and forest dwellers are again considered subordinate to the forest officers. So forest officers are often the object of mockery. So as a consequence of this particular protected areas, there is reductions of rights of access and use of these forest areas. So it often resulted in the illegal removal of wood, which is a source of conflict between the different villages, especially in the forest, are very much common. And there is also an unequal distributions of benefit arising out of tourism, and there is an involvement in tourism and development. And more importantly, there is restrictions on the resource use and access, which in some way lead to some forms of connivance between the local communities and the forest staff. And there is the issue of displacement as a consequence of these conservation programs. So the forest department have this idea that the practices of the local communities and their demographic growth contributed massively to the deteriorations of the biodiversity in that particular reserve. So the directors of the Project Tiger Reserve have hold the opinion that until when the local communities will live in the reserve, the environment will be unsafe and it will be damaged. So our priority is to save the tiger and other wild species. So the displacement is not therefore only appropriate but also unavoidable. So therefore, according to that Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, a natural zone that is to be a reserve must not present any permanent human population inside its territory. So in the case of the Sarisca Tiger Reserve, it would mean or it would lead to the displacement of more than 17 villages. So according to the villages, their presence actually did not considerably affect the biodiversity of the forest as such. On the contrary, it prevented illegal activities like poaching or wood cutting by outsiders. So in some way they have actually played the role of a custodian in those reserves. So therefore one can actually see that to critically look into the way in which how the notion of these guns and fences approach has actually undermined the very idea of conservation itself by creating arenas of conflict. The wildlife and human on the one hand, and the those authorities concerned and the people more importantly. So the answer to the questions from the case study is that the question of what, how, and by whom biodiversity actually should be protected, and which must be based on an interactive form of dialogue between local populations and the conservation authorities. So in other words, it begins with that paradigm of top down, but in the real sense, it has to be, in some way initiated from a bottom up kind of policies and programmed. So we have sort of tries to briefly look into the case of the Van Gunders pastoralist communities and the case of the Sarisca Tiger Reserve in a nutshell, to sort of like familiarize ourselves with the issues of conservation-induced displacement. And you can sort of like further refer to some of these readings which is being provided here, and that will enable you to have a much more ample knowledge about the issues which we have discussed and the case further. So I'll stop here, and then we'll continue discuss about the displacement, or maybe the Forest Right Act, and the dispossession vis-a-vis development in the upcoming class. Thank you.